Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis.
Matt Lewis with the Daily Beast. He's their senior columnist.
Friend of mine and friend of America.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Thank you for rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon. Our guest today is an award-winning psychologist who has served on the faculty of several prestigious colleges in the United States and has consulted for political leaders, nonprofits, and many of the world's most recognized brands. And he's also the author of a great new book. It's called Decoding Greatness: How the Best in the World Reverse Engineer Success. Ron Friedman, welcome to the news.
Thanks so much, Matt.
It's great to talk with you, and partly because I'm somebody who I don't know if I can aspire to greatness, but I try to succeed and be successful. And you know, you're either born brilliant or you get lucky, or you work hard and you work smart. And this is the kind of book that I think helps you do the latter, which is maybe my best hope.
Well, you might be selling yourself short here, Matt, but here's what I would say about the big idea here is that the stories that we've been told about success are wrong. Most of us have been told two major stories about how people vault to the top of their profession. The first story is that greatness comes from talent. So from this perspective, we're all born with certain innate strengths, and the key to finding your greatness is finding a field that allows your strengths to shine. The second story is the Malcolm Gladwell story. It's the story of practice. It's the idea that if you just do enough hard work and you do it for long enough, eventually you'll become great. But in the research for Decoding Greatness, what I found is that there is a third story, and it's one that's particularly applicable to knowledge work. So yeah, talent and practice count, but what's more important and what is the secret ingredient for many top performers, from inventors to entrepreneurs to artists, is reverse engineering. It's the skill of taking things apart, figuring out how they were created, and then identifying how you can apply those insights to your field.
Right. So I think, talent we can't control. You can try to go into a field that you're suited to. That's important, but you can't make yourself talented. Practice you can control, but practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. You could be practicing something the wrong way. But then what? Let's say you're practicing a lot. Then what? The next thing is, I think, what you're talking about is decoding what has worked for you or others. You start off the book with a really cool story, which I didn't know. We tend to think of people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs as these really maybe flawed but very brilliant men. But it turns out they decoded greatness too, didn't they?
That's exactly right. And this is what I'm saying, is that a lot of these stories come down to reverse engineering. We could talk about other examples first, but let me tell you about Jobs and Gates. So first, some context. Back in the 1980s, computers looked nothing like the sleek, intuitive devices we all use today. If you wanted a computer to do anything, you had to reach for your keyboard and input a rigid text-based language to input your instructions. Today, obviously, we don't have to do any of that. We can just point and click with our mouse. And the big innovation that allowed for that to happen is something called the graphic user interface. So it's actually called, among insiders, it's the GUI, the graphic user interface. And GUIs were not invented by either Jobs or Gates. They were invented by Xerox, and both Jobs and Gates identified this as an underutilized innovation that Xerox wasn't taking advantage of. And they both worked backwards. They reverse engineered it to figure out how it worked by looking at what it achieved. So kind of like taking a step back and saying, if I was to rebuild this from scratch, how would I go about it? But critically, they didn't just copy, they also evolved it. So Apple aimed to make computers user-friendly, and Microsoft focused on making computers affordable. So that was the key in both of their success. It's arguable that we may not have heard of either one of them had they not first reverse engineered their major innovation and then built on it to make a contribution to the world at large.
Well, you think of Xerox and you think of a company that makes photocopies, right? It's synonymous with making copies, but apparently they were both inspired by Xerox, right?
That's exactly right. And Xerox understood that a paperless office was on the horizon. And this is why they invested in innovations like the graphic user interface. The challenge for Xerox is that they were headed by a company of folks who were who grew up in the 1950s, and they could not envision a world in which personal computers were household items, because to them, typing was the domain of secretaries. So they couldn't see far enough ahead. Fortunately for all of us, Gates and Jobs could. And so they took this thing that Xerox wasn't utilizing and brought it to a mass audience by reverse engineering what they saw as successful. And the lesson here is not to find an underutilized innovation and copy it. It's to look for the elements that make things successful in all kinds of domains, whether it be a well-written email, maybe it's a podcast like this. Hey, this is a good podcast. What makes it successful, and how do I apply that to my domain? It's that kind of thinking that enables you to learn in real time and continue to grow your skills without just relying on books and courses.
Right. And so one of the things that you recommend is copying other people, which it sounds like a bad idea, right? This is all about being original, finding your own voice. So if you're copying other people, then how are you going to contrast them in the marketplace? But I've heard that like I think Hunter Thompson just kept rewriting The Great Gatsby over and over on his typewriter, and that helped him learn how to write. Of course, he doesn't sound like Fitzgerald. He's still probably Hunter Thompson, but there's something about copying greatness that actually rubs off.
That's exactly right. So what you're describing is the process of using something called copy work. And copy work was popularized by Benjamin Franklin. He did this in order to improve his writing ability. And it goes on through the generations, where you find that Stephen King did the same, and so did his son, Joe Hill, who copied Elmer Leonard. And what we mean by copy work is not simply to take someone else's work and slap your name on it and publish it and hope for the best. Sorry about that, Matt. You're able to edit, yes?
Yeah, no, it's not. You're not talking about like plagiarism. This is this is sort of a form of playfulness and practice that you're doing on your, in your off-duty hours.
That's exactly right. So what we're talking about here is taking something that is an established work, memorizing it, and then reproducing it. And what that process teaches you is that you're comparing your instinctive the wording that you would want to use, your instinct, and you're comparing that against the choices of a master. And that practice of comparing what you would have liked to have written versus what the author actually wrote teaches you their decision-making process. And there's also research showing that, contrary to what many of us would assume, copying actually makes us more creative. And so this is research out of the University of Tokyo, where they had amateur artists come into the lab, and they divided them into two groups. One group was asked to produce original art over the course of 3 days. The second group was asked to produce original art. Then they were asked on the second day to copy the work of an established artist. And then on the third day to resume producing original art. And then they had professional artists come in and rate the works of the two groups on their originality. And what they found was that the group that had paused to copy the work of an established artist was actually more creative on the final day of the experiment. And it wasn't by mimicking the style of the artist who they had copied, but it was going off in completely different direction. And what we're seeing as the reason for that is because, again, comparing and contrasting your instinct against the choices of a master opens your eyes up to completely new possibilities within your own work that you had been ignoring.
Kids used to have to do this in school. They would have to memorize like great poems, and they would have to, write stuff. And I think it was viewed as like archaic and busy work and a waste of time, right? Because now we could just Google a poem. There's no need to commit it to memory. But now I wonder if maybe they were onto something.
Yeah, and I think it really is. I think yes and no. So I think memorization for the sake of memorization, you could argue that there's value in that. I would say that perhaps that's missing a greater opportunity, which is to take the moment to reproduce it from your own memory and then compare it to look at the errors, because the errors are indicative of other choices that you're not picking up on that the master is.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the problems too is that the teachers get to decide who you're going to memorize as opposed to having the passion. Mm-hmm. So like you talk about Judd Apatow in the book, who's a comedian who's been successful, and he basically invented a way to get to interview a whole bunch of comedians and piece together, it was sort of reverse engineer their what works for them. And I have to say that's one of the benefits of me having this podcast. Sadly, like everybody and their brother has a podcast now, so it's getting harder. But aside from all the other benefits, like just the fact that I get to, read your book and interview you, it's a pretty amazing thing. And it sounds like Judd Apatow was onto this even before me.
That's right. It's one of my favorite stories in the book. So Judd Apatow is a 15-year-old teenager, and he is obsessed with comedy. He is washing dishes at the local comedy club. He's scheduling his week around who's playing what show when. And he enters high school, and he notices that the high school DJ is interviewing some really impressive rock bands. And so that's when inspiration strikes, and he thinks, wow, why don't I start my own radio program and interview comedians? Now, remember, this is going on way before years before podcasting. So he decides, I'm going to have a radio show interviewing comedians. He contacts the comedians' agents, and he's 15 years old. The radio signal doesn't reach beyond the school parking lot, but nobody knows this because this is in the 1980s or 70s or something like that. One of the two. And so he gets to interview Jerry Seinfeld, Jay Leno, Weird Al Yankovic. The list goes on. He by the end of it, he had a roadmap for becoming a comedian, for knowing how to get an agent, how to perform on stage. And he did it by interviewing his idols. Now, in many cases, we don't have the opportunity to interview our idols, but there are still techniques that you can use to reverse engineer finished work, which is what the book is about.
Definitely. Let's talk about some of the people who've sort of done this. Like one, and sometimes when you do it, you start to develop patterns, right? Like I know that, there's a theory, I guess, that Kurt Vonnegut actually discovered it. That there are only X number of archetypes, that almost every great movie or book fits into, one of these different formulas.
Yeah, this is another great example, as Kurt Vonnegut would reverse engineer popular stories. And his technique is fascinating because what he would do is he would convert words into pictures. And here's how he did it. For every story, he would draw a graph. Now, on that graph, he would plot the protagonist's fortunes over time. So on the x-axis, going from left to right, you have beginning to end. And on the y-axis, going from bottom to the top, is how are things going for the main character? Are they good or are they bad? And so it was almost like giving a story an x-ray to better understand its structure. And when Vonnegut did this, he discovered two fascinating things. One is that the vast majority of stories and books and films and theater, they fit neatly into one of 6 story arcs. The second thing he figured out is that many of the stories we absolutely love, the kinds that have been popular for generations, are basically the same story told with different characters. So, for example, Cinderella versus Annie. There is a remarkable degree of overlap between those two stories. Both of them start out with the hero in trouble. Cinderella's being abused by her stepmother and stepsisters. Annie is an orphan. Then the hero gets rescued, right? Daddy Warbucks. Cinderella goes to the ball. Then the hero reverts back to dire straits. So something bad happens, clock strikes midnight, Annie gets taken by 2 people pretending to be her parents until finally they're saved for good and live happily ever after. Basically the same story, different characters. And we don't notice it because we love those patterns so much.
Yeah. Well, I won't get into the question of why we love those patterns and whether there's something innate in us, but it does seem that we love them. And whether you're like a political columnist like I am, or whether you're a novelist, or whether you're a musician, right? Writing songs, it does seem like it is a mistake to become too weird, too avant-garde, that there is, that innovation is good, but too much innovation is not good. Mm-hmm. And this is actually something, I guess, that could be discovered by looking at what works and reverse engineering it.
That's exactly right. And in fact, that's what was done. And I talk about that research in the book, which is that often we assume that the more original idea, the better, but that's not what the research shows. As it turns out, when a product or idea is too original, it tends to fall flat. And it's because complete originality is not something people want. As a species, we are distrustful of the unknown. And that fear extends to the way that we interpret something that's completely new. And you see this all the time in music. You see it in movies. But you also see it in products. So for example, I have an Apple Watch. I love it. Smartwatches are fantastic. The smartwatch was created 20 years ago. And in fact, it was Seiko who had the first smartwatch. Then there was the Microsoft Spot Watch. Neither one of those are very popular today. And so what that tells you is that it's not enough to have a winning product. You also have to have consumer receptivity. And those two things are not necessarily born at the same time.
Yeah. We were talking before, and I think my book, Too Dumb to Fail, may be like the Seiko watch. I think I was onto something, but there wasn't as much consumer receptivity as we might have liked.
Well, the opposite of too dumb to fail is too smart to succeed, I guess.
Yes, I'd like to flatter myself and say ahead of my time, but you never know. We did well. We did well. So speaking of me, I've got a bunch of questions to ask you, but I just want to put a pin in it and pick your brain. So as I mentioned, I'm a political columnist, and I have to write like 3 columns a week, and that's a lot. It's hard to be original or creative or brilliant 3 times a week. So I could, and I have just sort of intuitively picked up on some formula. Like you got to have a really good lead, like a declarative lead that helps, and then a good, what we call a kicker at the end. But if you were me, and you were writing these many columns, would you wing it every time, or would you have a formula?
Oh, absolutely not. I think, let me just, to be clear, there are different phases of the writing. There's the idea generation, and then there's the execution. And I think the execution is where the formula is really helpful. The ideation part, though, that you kind of want to be a little bit unstructured. So I don't know about you, but I get my best ideas when I'm at the gym or the period after work. Maybe it's going for a swim. Often the shower is a great place to have ideas. It's because it's one of the few places where you're away from your phone. There's some white noise that's inherent in the experience. The warmth makes you comfortable, and that comfort allows your mind to wander. So there's a lot to say for the shower. But in terms of having a process, I mean, this is where I think some of the strategies in Decoding Greatness can really help. So one of the first things I recommend people do is start a collection. And what I mean by that is, when we think about collections, we think about physical objects like artwork or stamps. But here, that definition is far too narrow. If you look at people who are really good writers, copywriters, for example, will collect headlines. Those have a Google Doc with winning headlines that they have found in the past, or designers will collect logos. And so here, this is in that collection where you're able to detect what is different about this example relative to items that didn't make my collection. So compare the average headline to an extraordinary headline. So comparing the ordinary to the extraordinary, that's where you pick up on the ingredients that make a successful work unique. And through doing that, through A, collecting, and B, analyzing, now you're able to identify what are the things that really resonate with me. And then the final step is to templatize them. So turn winning examples into templates, and that will save you a lot of time in the article writing process, because now you have a lot of examples to go to.
So if you were me, would you begin, should I be looking to like David Foster Wallace columns, William F. Buckley columns, Joan Didion essays, and seeing what I like there? Or would this be, since I have a large enough oeuvre, should it be like columns that I wrote and sort of trying to see if there's a common denominator on the ones that worked and the ones that didn't? That's
interesting. I think it's a little bit of both. So I think the first, to speak to your first question, which is, should I look at Joan Didion, for example, it is really kind of being thoughtful about who are the people who I admire and getting analytical about what are they doing differently and how might I incorporate that into my work. That said, because you have a good sample size to pull from, I would evaluate the articles that succeeded versus ones that maybe didn't succeed as much to identify some of the common factors, because that tells you something important about your target audience. So part of my background, and I don't know if you know this about me, Matt, is we used to be a pollster. So I worked on the 2008 race. I don't know if your listeners will appreciate this, but I helped the Obama team a little bit. And I worked on a lot of congressional races. And one of the things that pollsters do is they will look at outliers to identify who are the audiences that are particularly receptive to my candidate. So for example, if my candidate resonates with a 45 to 54-year-old woman, chances are that same candidate is probably not going to do very well with men 60 plus. And it's because those are surrogate indicators of Democrat versus Republican. But that tells you where to buy your advertising and who to avoid in advertising, right? Who you don't want to target and who you want to focus on in terms of election day and bringing out to vote. What we're talking about here is that same approach for artistic works. Here, we're able to analyze the works that resonate with us to identify what are the features that make this successful. And now what that does is it arms you with so many insights about how to go about creating your own work more intelligently.
All right. So now I have some questions that I'm not exactly sure how they fit into the overarching structure of the book, Decoding Greatness. So maybe you can help me put it in context as I ask them. But they're all super interesting concepts. I mean, the first one actually, I think, makes sense. It's journaling. Talk about why we should all be keeping a journal.
Okay, so first, let me acknowledge that journaling has a shady, has many different definitions for a lot of different people. A lot of folks think when they hear journaling, we've just lost half our listeners, I think. But I want to reframe it for folks. So when I talk about journaling, I'm talking about an exercise that gives you a sense of the bigger picture of what's going on and what it is that you're learning every step of the way. And so in Decoding Greatness, I talk about how it is that athletes are so good at anticipating future events. And wouldn't that be a nice skill to have in all of our daily lives, is seeing things before they happen? And one of the techniques they use to get good at anticipation is they use reflective practice. Reflective practice is the exercise of looking back at past performance and identifying new insights that you uncovered by comparing your initial expectations to your actual experience. Most people don't do that. They're not athletes. They have no mechanism for doing that. But journaling is a process that can automate that for you. And in particular, when I say journaling, I'm referring to getting a 5-year journal that you can pick up on Amazon or any bookstore, really. That the way that these works is really interesting, is that they have one day for every day of the year, so 365 pages, and on every day there are 5 slots for entries. And those correspond to entries for the same day on different years. So all there is 3 lines for you to write on, so it's not very intimidating. You just write 3 lines about what it is that you did today or what it is that you learned today. And you do this every day for a year. And a year from now, when you come back, not only do you get to enter what it is that you did or learned today, you also get to see what it is you did or learned a year before. And that process of both reflecting on what it is that you learned today and seeing what it is that you learned a year ago makes it automatic for you to continuously get smarter, sharpen your memory, and also identify some overblown fears that seemed really problematic at the time, but you ended up navigating them really well, and that builds your courage.
So is it like, talk about how that fits into decoding greatness?
Sure. So the first half of the book is about how do I reverse engineer all these great examples, identify what they're doing differently, and then evolve them to make them my own. So how do I reverse engineer, but also evolve to be successful? But once you know how to reverse engineer, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be good at it right out of the gate. So for example, if I reverse engineer all of your podcasts, that doesn't make me a great podcast host. I just understand your structure and what makes you effective at asking questions and listening very attentively. In order to improve my skills, I need a different set of strategies. And that's what the second half of Decoding Greatness is about. It's about shrinking something I refer to as the vision ability gap. It was Ira Glass who coined that, the famous NPR host. And what he was referring to there is that when you have great taste and when you know you know what it is you're looking to achieve, there's going to be a long while before you get there because your skills haven't caught up to your vision. And so what you really want to focus on is narrowing the gap between your vision and your ability. And so the second half of Decoding Greatness is all about strategies we can use to accelerate our skills and learn faster. And one of those techniques is self-reflection or journaling.
Interesting. No, I could see how it would work. I mean, there could be weird correlations, right? Like maybe every autumn you get depressed,
Exactly.
or But you don't know that. But now if you know it, get prepared. It's going to happen. And or maybe it is every time you eat chicken, you do really good at baseball, and then you're like Wade Boggs. Just
That's
eat
right.
chicken every. You know, there could be some weird correlations that you're not aware of until you look at the journal.
That's right. It's you're identifying the drivers of success, and it is sometimes the things that drive your success are not apparent on the surface. So I'll give you an example in my own life, and I mentioned the Apple Watch a little earlier. One of the things that the Apple Watch allows me to do is measure the amount of deep sleep I have every night. Now, deep sleep for a lot of people, and especially for me, really impacts my performance at work, particularly my ability to write, because writing requires the ability to um, avoid distractions and a lot of discipline. And if I don't have my deep sleep, there's going to be a lot of distractions. So what I've discovered, it's not that just that deep sleep is a driver of success, but what's the thing that comes before the thing? So for me, for whatever reason, water intake really drives deep sleep. So if I don't drink enough water, I'm not going to sleep deeply. And so now that I know that, I can track my water, and I do. I track my water intake, and it's great because now I know that that's a driver. I would never have known that without doing that self-reflection process.
Was it through journaling that you figured out that there's a correlation between how much water you drink and how well you sleep?
That was part of it where it's particularly the cardio element of it. So there was kind of like the journaling helped me with the first step, which is that if I didn't understand that if I wasn't exercising regularly, I would not sleep well. And so that completely changed my perspective on exercise. I used to think exercise was like me being selfish because if I was worked on a team, I'd have to leave early to go to the gym or come in late. And I would feel like I was being selfish to others. And then when I started noticing what an impact it had on my performance, now I view exercise as part of my job, where I don't feel guilty about leaving at 6 to go swimming or play pickleball or whatever the case may be. Now I see it as part of my job, and it's changed my relationship with exercise, and it's certainly elevated my health.
Some of this is interesting how I've just sort of intuitively come to this myself. You know, like as a writer, sometimes if somebody writes something similar to what I'm going to write about,
Mhm.
sometimes I want to read it. Like
You
definitely want
do,
to find out what they said. Sometimes I will avoid it because I don't want to copy them.
right?
Or I don't want to have my take be polluted or watered
Mhm.
down by them.
Mhm.
And you write about that. It's called willful ignorance. And Tom Petty was a prime example of this, right?
Yeah, well, so Tom Petty realized that there was a significant overlap between his musical writing style and Bruce Springsteen's. And so he would refuse to listen to Bruce Springsteen because he didn't want to exacerbate that similarity. And so willful ignorance turns out to be one of the strategies for evolving someone else's formula. And it's kind of ironic because what we're talking about is avoiding everyone else's influence as a way of evolving. And the reason that works is because so many of your contemporaries are consuming the same podcasts, reading the same articles, reading the same newsletters, and so it's a lot harder to stand out if you're consuming the same information as everyone else. So by being deliberate about what it is you want to ignore, you can actually get a little bit better at being unique.
So that's an example of something in this book that I sort of knew intuitively, but it makes me feel good to have it confirmed. There are other things in the book that surprise me. And here's one. You say visualize process,
Mm.
but not success.
Yeah. So visualizing success, if you go online, you'll see a lot of stories about people saying if you view yourself succeeding, that makes success a lot easier. And that's an appealing notion. And a lot of celebrities believe it. We have stories of Jim Carrey talking about how when he was an unemployed actor, he wrote himself a check for, I think it was $10 million. And he was able to cash that. I think he wrote it for 5 years in the future. And on the day before the check was about to expire, he got a actual $10 million check for doing Dumb and Dumber. And so it's an appealing notion. And you see people like this on talk shows. And so we like to believe it. But there's research on this, and it shows that visualizing success not only doesn't work, but actually makes it less likely that you'll succeed. And I'll tell you a brief study about this where, yeah, this is a UCLA study where they had 100 introductory psychology students come into the lab, and they divided them into 3 groups. And they said to the first group, we want you to visualize yourself doing really well on the midterm. The second group was told to visualize themselves studying for the midterm. And the third group was told simply to track the number of minutes they spent studying. So basically, that was a control group. And what they found was that the group that had visualized themselves doing well on the exam actually performed worse than the two other groups. The reason for that is because when we visualize success, we are temporarily sated. We can sit back and enjoy the glory of that feeling that comes with having succeeded, and that makes us less likely to do the actual work. In contrast, if you visualize yourself studying, you're front loading some of the decisions that are involved in having to study. So you're thinking about, where am I going to go study? What materials do I need with me? What do I do with my phone? Do I put it away? Now, when it actually comes time for you to study, you're not only more likely to do it, you're more likely to do it successfully. Yeah. And so visualizing process, not outcome.
I love this one. And I'll tell you, when I was a young person, I always had this undeserved confidence. Like, I don't think it showed up in the sense that I was egotistical, but like I'll call it like delusions of grandeur. I always just kind of thought I was going to be successful. And consequently, I really didn't do much work. I really didn't read or study for a long time. And so there's this thing about the power of positive thinking that resonates with the Jim Carrey story. But upon reflection, I think it's actually kind of, I'm sure there are a lot of losers out there who really thought that they were going to be a big star someday.
That's really interesting, because I think what you just described is something a lot of us went through as teenagers. And I think it also speaks to the fact that if you have the right peer group, you're more likely to take action on that success. And so the challenge, I think, for a lot of people is that the delusion of grandeur, whether it is useful or harmful, depends on who they have around them. So if they have those delusions of grandeur and they have no way of executing against them because they don't have anyone to point the way, then they're not going to go anywhere. But there's an argument that having those delusions of grandeur and having people around you who can help you make that a reality can actually be helpful. So sometimes that optimism can work in your favor. What's really critical is who your peer group is and whether or not you're spending time with the right people.
I think that's true, right? I mean, so if I had said to myself, living in, my dad's a prison guard, I'm sitting in Wolfsville, Maryland, that if I'd said to myself, like, you're going to be on Morning Joe someday. You're going to write a book that's going to be in the front page of the New York Times book review. Like, if I didn't have a delusional sense, like I wouldn't have, I don't think I would have pursued it at all. Like I wouldn't have believed that it was possible. I would have given up. So I guess you do need to have a little bit of this winsome naivete to try it. But by the same token, at some point you have to like start working hard and actually doing the process and paying your dues.
Yeah. You know what? I would take delusions of grandeur over low expectations any day of the week.
And you heard it from a psychologist, folks.
Well, because I think what happens is if you don't have those expectations of success, you're not going to try. And so chances of you being successful are nil if you don't expect to be successful. And so therefore, there are times when embracing those illusions of grandeur can actually be helpful. And there's I don't know if you've read the biography by Steve Martin, where he talks about how he's realized in retrospect that so many of his expectations had such a low percentage of transpiring, but if he hadn't had them, he never would have tried. Yeah. And he talks about that being kind of an element of youth. And looking back now, some of the things he's achieved seem to be impossible, let alone the things he was trying to do. And so I think it's good to dream big, but just don't assume that because you're dreaming big, you're going to be successful. You also need to do the work. And some of the strategies we're talking about today can help you get there.
I love it. Pray as if it all depends on God. Work as if it all depends on you.
That's right.
There's a related thing that worked for me, which I have this amazing physical therapist she's into, I don't know, it's like Eastern stuff, and it's like postural realignment, and you name it. And a few years ago, I was, so people who listen to me probably think that that I know what I'm doing, but I don't. And I have some anxiety sometimes. And I was traveling a lot to New York, and I'm actually like an introvert. And like I was the kind of kid that like literally I was afraid. I wouldn't even buy anything at 7-Eleven because like the social interaction of having to go up and give the cashier money in exchange for a candy bar, that was too much friction. I would rather just not have the candy bar. So I just like very introverted in that sense, which is weird for a guy who talks on TV and speaks. But anyway, it is what it is. But she had me do this. I was going to New York all the time, and she had me like envision like I didn't take the train, mostly I flew, but she had me like envision like I'm wearing a really nice suit and I get on the plane and I sit. And so it wasn't me envisioning being on TV. It was me envisioning like going to New York.
Right.
And I'm, telling jokes and I'm funny on the plane and everything's great and it's glamorous on the plane. And, so it was envisioning or visualizing like the process of like of traveling, which to me was a very stress inducing situation. And I think it actually worked.
Yes. And in fact, this is part of why we talked about reflective practice. That's practicing in the past. We all know about practicing in the present, but there's also something called imagery, which is practicing in the future. So in Decoding Greatness, I talk about these three processes as practicing in 3 dimensions. And what you've just touched on is the value of using imagery to walk through all of the steps you need to execute to be successful. And what that does is visualizing every step of the way reduces your anxiety because now it feels controllable. And this is why imagery is helpful, not just in sports, but there's research showing that if you're a public speaker, visualizing yourself on stage, executing your speech will make you more persuasive when you actually deliver that speech. There's also research showing that surgeons who visualize a procedure are less likely to make a mistake. And even piano students, if they visualize themselves learning a new piece and playing it, they're likely to learn it faster. And there's a statistic in the book that I talk about where athletes who use visualization are actually able to cut down on their physical practice regimen by up to 50% and be no less successful because the imagery is doing that much of the heavy lifting.
It's pretty amazing. Talk about Marlon Brando's acting class.
Oh boy.
Sounds amazing. It sounds like the kind of class you'd want to take if you were famous, even.
Right. So Marlon Brando, before his passing, put on an acting seminar and invited the who's who of Hollywood. And there's an assumption we all have that when someone's an expert, they know exactly what it is that makes them successful. And so this is a story I use in the book to illustrate just how much of a gap there is between someone having expertise and having the ability to share that expertise with you. And so there's all this research showing that the researchers who produce the most journal articles are actually no better at teaching their course materials than an adjunct professor. In fact, chances are the adjunct professor will be a better instructor. And so in the case of Marlon Brando, he puts on this 10-day seminar. He hires a director. He's thinking he's going to turn this class into a course that he can sell to film schools. And it is an utter disaster from day one, where he has homeless people come up on stage. So he tries to teach them how to act. He invites the folks in the class to get undressed in full view of their classmates, and people just stage a walkout. Even the director quits. And it's just a story that goes to show that here's the guy who, taught everyone method acting. He's the Time Magazine declared him the actor of the century, and he was no better or probably worse than most novice actors at teaching others how to act.
It's amazing. This is why Crash Davis will be a great minor league baseball manager and maybe even a major league manager one day, right? Because he was a catcher and he was really good in the minor leagues, but not good enough to make it to the major leagues. And so he had to learn the game. He couldn't just rely, like Nuke LaLoosh in Bull Durham could just rely on, the gods giving him this amazing arm. Crash had to learn how to play and make the most of his talent.
I just think that more podcasts need more Bull Durham references. This is what I love about this show.
But there's truth in it. I mean, I used to teach guitar
Uh-huh.
at the mall, the Francis Scott Key Mall in Frederick, Maryland. And I always thought, like, I'm not a great guitarist, and that's why I could teach, because because I think that people who are great at playing guitar don't actually know what they're doing. They're just naturals.
Well, it's part of it is that they may be naturals, but a bigger part, I think, is that they have automated so much of the process where they're not consciously thinking about this. And in fact, there's research showing that if you talk to an expert, 70% of the steps that they use to decide what to do next go missing. In other words, they will not share that with you. And it's because of the curse of knowledge. So the curse of knowledge, for anyone who's not familiar, is the idea that knowing something makes it impossible to imagine not knowing it. So just the fact that you have expertise, if you were to teach me how to produce a podcast, there's a good likelihood that you would forget many of the steps. It's because you don't even think about them. They're just automatic for you because you're an expert. And that tells us that talking to someone who has succeeded and just assuming that they're going to be able to tell us how they did it, likely not going to work out. That's why you need to come prepared with a list of questions. I share them in the book. I'll give you just one example, which is you want to ask them about their discoveries. So don't ask them, hey, how do I become a great podcaster? Say, hey, what did you focus on at the beginning that ended up not being very important? And those types of questions force them to go back in time and think about when they first started and compare what they actually learned in the process. And that's where you get some of the best insights.
Yes, those are really good questions, and you're right, because I think so many of the other questions are cliched, and so we have sort of pat answers. But if you can force them to think, I do think, though, tell me if I'm wrong, that somebody who is like naturally gifted at something will be less able to teach it than somebody who had to work really hard at learning it themselves.
I think that's exactly right. And I think it's because the latter example, the person who had to struggle, had to spend more time overcoming obstacles and figuring out those challenges. And when you have to overcome those obstacles, you have more experience with both dealing with challenges, but also solving for them.
That's me. And I think these questions that you're referring to, and there's a whole list of them in the book, worth the price of the book alone, they're in the two categories, process and discovery, right?
I think there's one other one, which I'm not remembering right now. But
Called journey questions.
journey, process, discovery. So an example of a process question is actually taking people through their process. So it might be, hey, Matt, so when you're thinking about starting a podcast, what did you first? And then I listen and then I pause and I say, okay, what's next? And what's after that? And you really got to probe to have you walk me through your process in order to get all of the details. And a lot of this comes from, I mentioned my background in politics. I also did focus group moderating. And so a lot of the strategies that focus group moderators use to get people to open up and share their secrets are ones that you can use when interviewing experts. And just to give you a preview of one of them, one of the strategies that they use is they adopt a mindset of naive curiosity. So we've all heard the saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. And I love that saying because it means that if you're not learning, you're doing something wrong. And I think it's worth thinking about when you consider where you work for a living. If you're not learning from your colleagues, maybe it's time for a change. But focus group moderators are never the smartest person in the room because they temporarily subvert their ego. They just want to let the other person be smart, because if you're trying to get someone else to open up, you don't want to show them how smart you are, because that gets them to clam them up, which is why Matt is doing such a great job of letting me be the hero of this podcast. Because if Matt were to show up how much he knows, I'd probably just, whittle my answers down to yes or no answers.
Well, this has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Let's, I guess, just any final. So, like, obviously, there's no way we've barely scratched the surface. Everyone should get the book. It's called Decoding Greatness. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Well, one of the things that I hope people take away from this book is that the idea that you can't succeed at that big, hairy, ambitious goal that you have because you don't have the talent or because you don't have 10 years to practice. I just want you to let go of that and just realize that there's a faster way, and that's reverse engineering. That's what this book offers you. And I just think that it's time that we all considered some more ambitious goals instead of just allowing our dreams to fade away.
I love it. Yeah, I again, there's talent, then there's practice, and then there's this, and this is probably the one that people don't know about as much.
Right.
So get the book. It's called Decoding Greatness: How the Best in the World Reverse Engineer Success. Ron Friedman, thank you for coming on the news.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Matt.
If you like this podcast, rate and review it on iTunes. Follow Matt on Twitter at Matt K. Lewis. Thank you for listening to Matt Lewis and the News.